Thank you, everybody, for being part of today's zazen kai at Village Zendo. I wish I could join you. I'm sure you have sore knees and unquiet thoughts, but in addition to that, I hope that you may have experienced a deepened feeling of connection and oneness with your fellow seekers in the Zendo and in the wider world. In this talk, I'd like to offer some stories, and that's really what they are, about the feeling of oneness with, well, it doesn't really matter what you feel one with. It certainly doesn't have to be the big cosmic deal that we hear about both from serious sources and that ancient, and I do mean ancient, joke about the Zen master and the hot dog vendor, make me one with everything. But oddly, being at one doesn't have to be with everything, because when you're at one, the smallest thing is everything. Follow me so far, like Groucho Marx said. Follow me any further, I'll have you arrested. But seriously, when you resolve something with a friend or a lover, the whole universe is at one, at least for a while. And those kind of occurrences are all around us, I've been realizing, easily overlooked in the day-to-day, sometimes screened out by fear or by bias. But when you start looking, these stories about oneness reflect how change happens and how growth occurs and how suffering minute by minute is resolved. The stories I'm going to offer today are not particularly orderly. They're from my life, they have to be, and they're about occasions when I was changed by seeing oneness, also called non-separateness, in action. And that sounds like a big pretentious claim, perhaps. I don't mean it that way at all. But I'll tell you one secret. When I first considered this topic, I thought I'd make a grand unifying theory out of it. And as a result, I've had to rewrite the draft 4 times because all those theoretical bits were glaringly awful. So please don't expect these stories to be capital E explanatory. At best, they're illustrations of a mystery. So here's the first story. Early in my Zen practice, I had a particularly vivid experience of non-separateness. It was during Kinhin. The hall where we sat sesshin was literally medieval, and light came from a very few naked bulbs hung from giant beams. As we walked around the room, our shadows followed us, of course, projected on shoji walls. And because our steps were so rhythmic, at each move, shadow B would step into A's place, C would step into B's, and so on. Now, everybody there was shave-headed, but I could always keep track of myself because I was 6'3", and my shadow towered over the Japanese monks that were all around me. As I was reveling in this thought, the Kinhin line moved into a slightly different location, and a different beam of light somehow made us all look the same height. Suddenly, I couldn't tell which one was me, which one was my buddy from Germany, and which were the Japanese monks. And the effect was rather mind-boggling. I knew these shadows had to be connected to me and they were moving, but I wasn't one of them somehow. And so here I was, an avowed nonconformist, and abruptly I was not separate from my companions. The defensiveness and resentment, near contempt for ritual that I had carried even in my training up to that point suddenly just slipped off like the shadows they were. And they were replaced by a feeling of being with people like myself who are traveling the same road. So call it non-separateness or oneness. It's still powerful stuff, even when it's an illusion in a shaft of artificial light. Sometimes oneness occurs, you might say, of itself, and other times it needs to be provoked. For example, the physical form of a monastic community tries to make us unsettled as regards our separateness and individuality. In old school Zen, the monks live, meditate, and sleep in the Zendo. All space is common space. You don't have a room to go hide in when zazen gets hard. The monks wear identical robes, they have identical bald heads, they measure personal space by the dimensions of a zabuton, and they perform the same tasks and gestures at the same time every day, or almost every day. And these forms, evolved over centuries, seem to me to be designed to banish separate individual identity. Learning these forms as well as trying to ditch your ego creates a lot of tension. It radiates from your body, it's telegraphed by your posture. When advanced students are having a bad day, it's the same thing. It's not something that is exclusive to beginners. And this tension can become visible even in such apparently simple tasks as ringing a bell during a ceremony. Confronted with the bell, a lot of us grab whatever serves as a striker, a mallet, a drumstick, a metal rod, in the strongest death grip we can muster, and then smack the instrument using it. And of course, the result will be a protesting screech, a dull thud, or even a feedback vibration that hurts your hand. Eventually, shaking the tension out of your hands, you learn to grip the striker gently and with kindness, and to use a smooth move at the wrist, and suddenly you produce a sound that's worth hearing. Become one with the bell, grasshopper. The second story I'd like to share. Can you imagine becoming one with someone who is in the process of attacking you? In Aikido, the gentle, nonviolent martial art that I've been teaching for, can it really be 40 years? Oneness is essential to doing any self-defense technique correctly. To do Aikido, you have to know the attacker's mind, as it's called, to become one with him. And yes, attackers are far too often he/hims. To agree with the trajectory or the direction that he's chosen, look where he's looking, and lead his energy just a little further than he planned. At that point, you can help him fall down without being hurt and without hurting anybody else either. And none of this is really hard to learn or do until you're actually under attack. And when you're under attack, evolution has ensured that our instinct is to flail, to fight, to flee, or to freeze, all the F words. To strike out, shove, and kick, to try, in supposed self-defense, to hurt or destroy the other person. And those separate, isolated, and fearful responses almost never end well. What works, and this has been tried for centuries, long before Aikido became a formal thing even, what works is relaxation, posture, deep breathing, many of the things that we know from Zen practice that we do on our cushion, except you're doing them in action, and they help to be able to protect yourself. Now, here's a place where I want to insert a captivating theory or take credit for my immense skill in defending myself, preventing accidents, and so on. It's not working. So don't try it at home, kids, until you've had some instruction. The third story. Sometimes, and it's most evident with animals, it seems to me, the connections that we make depend on being open to what shows up almost accidentally. And sometimes it seems accidental, and yet it can't really be. Let me tell you what I'm trying to talk about. We, long time ago, had a small gray cat. And when the small gray cat died, our house felt just unbearably empty. My wife Mary and I set out to find a new companion. And it seemed like a daunting task. At the shelter, all the cats that were ready for adoption were loose in a big room where we, their potential humans, could interact with them. You can imagine the chaos and cacophony that filled that room. I was reminded of a wonderful kids book called Millions of Cats that I read when I was a child. It had, as children's books do, a repeated refrain: hundreds of cats, thousands of cats, millions and billions and trillions of cats. And that's how I felt in that room. How out of so many were we to establish not just a connection, but the right connection? Mary was feeling really overwhelmed trying to juggle all the expectations we had for this new animal in our lives. The new cat had to be female, had to be a different color than the previous one, had to be even tempered, had to be happy to be picked up and petted, and so on, and so on, and so on. I was just about as overwhelmed, but I tend to fade into the background a little while I consider. And so I was standing by, giving Mary some space, when suddenly the left leg of my trousers twitched pretty hard. I was startled, so I reacted automatically, moving my hands to ward off whatever had bumped me. I looked down to find a tiny black and white tuxedo cat actually curled up in my left palm, apparently sound asleep and as relaxed as if she'd been there for an hour. You could say that we had become non separate in that moment, and we remained so for the rest of her entire life. Describing the look on my face later, Mary got to use one of her favorite rare words. He was absolutely gobsmacked, she likes to say, and I was. That little cat, soon to be named Deco, as in Art Deco, was actually a premature tiny kitten, but already a master of non separateness and interbeing. With me, she'd accomplished a pretty remarkable feat, or maybe I should say leg. But think about it. To start with, she had to risk a flying leap at a creature 12 times her size and clamber up what amounted to Mount Everest without clawing me through my pants. If she'd done that, I would have thrown her off with a literal knee jerk. But somehow she shocked me into just the right action so that without a moment's conscious thought, I caught her without squeezing her half to death and positioned my cupped hand for service as Her Majesty's bed. And that was how she found her forever home. It's a cute story, unless you're more of a dog person, but to me, it offers a lot to think about. How do you suppose Deco modulated her athletic assault so that my responses served her purposes? Kind of suspicious. She created a Goldilocks interaction. And yes, I'm mixing my animal metaphors. Her ascent triggered me to react, not too much, not too little, just right. As she was actually a motherless cat and too young to have learned the kind of discernment that would allow a learned behavior to accomplish what she did. So I'm inclined to believe that her response to me was something almost hardwired. Our society doesn't believe animals are intelligent enough to calculate such an astonishing sequence of events, but something made it all work. Of course, I wasn't exactly a passive partner in this episode of Inner Being either. I had to react with some skill, not only to avoid crushing her, but to provide a safe haven for her in that frantic, upregulated room. But I did it with no thought whatsoever. And although, as I've said, I'm a black belt in Aikido, I can't ever remember being trained to grab kittens in midair. The question which remains for me all these years later is this: what gave that little cat the impression or the information that it was worth taking a big calculated risk on yours truly? What was it that she sensed about the situation that led her to jump on me and not some other person? To act in that brief window that was available to her instead of hesitating? Did she perhaps just become one with the situation and improvise? I don't know. It appears to me that her leap not only established a wordless connection, a sense of oneness with me, but also activated what I have to describe as an existing inner connection. What happened seems clear, but why or how, not so much. I'm glad it did. The fourth story that I would like to share with you sounds a bit dubious until you see it in action, but it turns out that we human beings can actually make use of becoming one to help wild or terrified or injured animals. It works with people too, but we tend to rely on words and well-known social gestures in those situations. Um, that's not so much an option with animals. And by becoming one with them, even if it's almost in your imagination, some very remarkable things can happen. This is the only story today that is secondhand. I never knew Mary's father except from tales that she could tell about him. He apparently made his living in the 1920s as a barnstormer, those guys that would fly biplanes through barns through the open doors with 6 inches of clearance. And he also apparently did wing walking, where somebody else is flying the plane and you walk around on top of it. So he had good balance and control over his mind pretty clearly. He also was skilled at driving multiple horse teams, 6 or 8 horses all in harness. And as a show off stunt, since this was done as entertainment, he would actually stand up on the back of 2 of the horses and run them around an arena. So one day when Mary was 5 or 6, her dad got a call about a horse. It had been a rodeo animal for years, and in the course of one too many beatings, excuse me, this gets me every time. In the course of one too many beatings, the horse had kicked and killed his tormentor. So the caller told Mary's dad, "I think this one's worth saving." And Mary's father took off with the horse trailer. Mary, of course, stationed herself on the upstairs porch to watch, while her mother hung out in the kitchen because she didn't want to watch. Anyway, the truck and the trailer returned, and Mary could see and hear the trailer crashing side to side with the strength of the animal's struggles. Her father parked the trailer and got out the horse, which was wearing only a halter and a long lead rope. As Mary watched, the horse tried to run, but her father guided it into a circle around him. And as the horse ran around and around, Mary's father did the things that we do in zazen and in Aikido. He kept his posture relaxed, his breathing deep, and his focus on the horse. And for what seemed like an eternity to a little girl, he kept the horse running. No whipping, no beating. He wasn't breaking the horse. Instead, we later learned that horse ran to what's called its biological flight distance, something that is built into horses. It's the distance necessary to outrun a large predator, and it amounts to about a quarter of a mile. And at the end of running that distance, the horse, who was tired but not really exhausted, bent down his head and neck almost to the ground, which in a herd would have been a signal to the lead horse that our horse needed leadership and help. Essentially, that horse had just accepted Mary's father as the lead. The horse began walking slowly to him, and Mary's father did something kind of odd. He turned his back to the horse and walked slowly away from it, and the horse kept following. Turning his back is a kind of non-threatening behavior that allowed the horse to feel like this person wasn't trying to hurt him. And as this happened, the horse permitted the man to rub its face and neck. More time passed doing that, and the man was allowed to mount up and ride. Think about it. Mount up and ride. A horse that's just killed somebody and is otherwise slated for the dog food factory. So essentially, what Mary's father and people who have similar training, what he did was to become one with the horse. I suspect he would have snorted at using that language about it, but that's what he did. And he gained its trust and cooperation instead of tying it down or beating it into submission. They named the horse Red. And can you believe how much confidence he had? He gave it to his daughter. She remembers lying on his back out in the pasture, barely moving while she read a book. That's what trust and becoming one can do. It turns out Mary's father was a horse whisperer, following a method that was developed by a man named Monty Roberts. He's more or less the star of a movie that, at least here, is currently in theaters called The Cowboy and the Queen. And if you want more details and to actually see instead of just hearing from me, it's an excellent movie. Roberts had grown up in cowboy culture in rural California, and from the time he was 3, he was riding and watching horses, and he'd seen many horses broken, the vicious, old-fashioned way of getting them to be cooperative with humans. Um, Probably not coincidentally, he had himself also been brutally beaten when his father decided to punish him for something. And determined to change that cycle of violence, he learned by observation how to calm a horse and gain its trust. The result was what Mary's father had learned to do. Um, his methods involving the non-threatening behavior, tiring the horse until it knows it needs help, and so on, are to me strikingly similar to Aikido and Zen methods. Um, Roberts worked as a horse trainer for many years using these methods and later founded a nonprofit for people who are suffering from PTSD, primarily veterans and first responders. And what that nonprofit does is give those sufferers a chance to go into the arena with a horse and tame it using those methods, which turns out to be a highly effective method of therapy for the person because of the trust building that is involved. Personally, I'd say the guy is a cowboy bodhisattva. So I'm not going to belabor any glorious conclusion for these mixed stories. I think you can see, I hope you can see, that they all have the same topic. That when we drop our barriers and open up and become one with just about anything, things change. And I hope that understanding will sneak into your worldview and that without having to make a big effort at it, you'll notice that this is happening all around you all the time. If it does, good for you. If it doesn't, you can blame my writing. It's hard to express these things. But in the end, the things that we do to engage the trust and the comfort of other beings, deep breathing, stable, relaxed posture, a mind as empty as we can get it of preconceptions, are also precisely what we can do for ourselves when the days are dark. And so non-separateness comes full circle, and we're not separate from ourselves. Thank you.